7 countries. Right now, as you watch this, 7 countries are in the process of collapse. Not metaphorical collapse, not the kind of slow decay that economists euphemistically call structural adjustment. I mean real civilizational unraveling. And the first one on this list is going to shock you because it is not a war zone. It is not a sanctioned, strangled pariah state. It is a place the Western media has been calling for the past decade a success story. Let me take you back. Let me show you what was visible to anyone paying attention. Not to the headlines, not to the press releases from Washington and Brussels, but to the underlying architecture of power, debt, dependency, and demographic fragility that holds or breaks a modern state. The patterns were there. They are always there. The question is whether you are trained to see them. We live in an era of spectacular distraction. Every week brings a new crisis, a new outrage, a new villain for the algorithm to amplify. And while the world is looking at the spectacle, the real collapses, the slow-motion tectonic shifts that reshape the international order for generations, these happen quietly, almost invisibly, until suddenly they don't. Until suddenly they happen all at once, and everyone looks up from their phones and asks, how did this happen so fast? It didn't happen fast. That is the first thing you must understand. What looks like sudden collapse is always the last chapter of a very long book. Every empire, every state, every system that has ever failed gave decades of warning signals before the final rupture. The problem is that most people are not reading the book. They are watching a highlight reel. And highlight reels don't show you the rot in the foundation. So let's talk about the first country. And yes, it will surprise you. France, not Syria, not Venezuela, not some African nation the Western commentariat already wrote off. France, the 5th largest economy in the world, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, a nuclear-armed state, a founding member of the European Union. France is entering a phase of political and social decomposition that by any serious historical metric qualifies as pre-collapse. And the reason nobody wants to say this out loud is that saying it out loud violates the foundational mythology of the liberal international order. The idea that advanced Western democracies are, by definition, immune to the forces that bring down lesser states. They are not immune. They never were. And France is the proof. Look at what has happened in France over the past 8 years. 3 consecutive governments unable to complete their mandates without emergency powers. A pension reform that triggered the largest sustained street mobilization since 1968, not for weeks but for months. An agricultural sector in open revolt. A police force that has, in certain suburban territories, effectively ceded operational control to parallel power structures. A bond market that is quietly, politely, but unmistakably beginning to price in political risk in ways it has not done since the 1990s. And an electoral landscape so fragmented that the concept of a governing majority has become nearly theoretical. None of this is secret. All of it is publicly available data. But because France is France, because it carries the symbolic weight of the Enlightenment, of liberté, égalité, fraternité, of everything the Western order tells itself it represents, the analytical class refuses to apply to France the same diagnostic framework it would immediately apply to, say, Pakistan or Peru. That double standard is not just intellectually dishonest, it is dangerous, because it means the warning signs go unread until it is too late to course correct. Now let's move to the second collapse, because it is, in a different way, even more instructive. Ethiopia. Here is a country that, as recently as 2019, was receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. Its prime minister was celebrated across the international media as a transformational leader, a visionary, a man who had ended a decades-long conflict with a neighboring state and was ushering his country into a new era of democratic openness. The international investment community was excited. The development agencies were optimistic. The narrative was irresistible. 2 years later, one of the worst civil wars of the 21st century was consuming the country's northern regions. Atrocities were being committed on a scale that the United Nations, using its characteristic euphemism, described as among the most horrific in the world. Hundreds of thousands were dead, millions were displaced. The Nobel laureate was directing a military campaign that independent investigators were documenting with the language of war crimes. What happened? Nothing happened that wasn't already visible in 2019 to anyone who looked past the Nobel narrative. Ethiopia is a federation of deeply distinct ethnic, linguistic, and regional communities held together not by genuine civic integration, but by elite bargains and historically by authoritarian force. When the force was relaxed, when the liberalization that earned the Nobel Prize loosened the mechanisms of central control, the underlying centrifugal forces didn't disappear. They accelerated because they had never been resolved. They had only been suppressed. The lesson of Ethiopia is the lesson of every federal state that has tried to manage ethnic pluralism through top-down political theater rather than genuine structural accommodation. It is the lesson of Yugoslavia. It is the lesson of the Soviet Union. It is the lesson that political scientists have been writing about since the 1990s. And yet, every generation, the international community rediscovers it with fresh shock, as though it had never happened before. Pakistan is the third country on this list. And here the collapse is unfolding in slow motion across three simultaneous axes: fiscal, military, and political legitimacy. The fiscal situation is not a crisis that can be resolved by the next IMF program. Pakistan has been in and out of IMF programs for 70 years. This is not a temporary liquidity problem. This is a structural condition in which the state cannot generate sufficient revenue to fund basic functions, because the elite that controls the state has successfully exempted itself from taxation for generations, because the military consumes a disproportionate share of public resources and is not accountable to civilian oversight, and because the agricultural sector, which employs the majority of the population, operates under feudal land arrangements that systematically impoverish the rural poor while enriching a small class of landlords who also dominate the legislature. Add to this the political crisis unleashed by the arrest of a former prime minister with a genuine mass following, the subsequent crackdown on civil society and media, the open rift between civilian political institutions and the military establishment that has historically been the de facto sovereign authority, and you have a state in which the basic mechanisms of legitimacy, elections, rule of law, peaceful transfer of power have been so thoroughly compromised that large segments of the population have simply stopped believing in them. A state can survive many things. It cannot survive the mass withdrawal of legitimacy belief. When enough people, enough of the educated middle class, enough of the youth, enough of the business community decide that the system is not reformable from within, the options that remain are emigration, radicalization, or passive withdrawal. All three are happening in Pakistan simultaneously and at scale. The fourth country is one that the world has been watching for 2 years but consistently misunderstanding: Ukraine. Not because Ukraine is losing, the military picture remains genuinely contested and is not my subject here. Ukraine is collapsing in a different and more fundamental sense, demographically and institutionally. The demographic losses from this war, killed, wounded, displaced abroad, internally displaced, represent a generational hemorrhage from which no reconstruction plan, however generously funded, can simply recover by writing checks. A country is not its GDP. A country is its people, their relationships, their institutional memory, their capacity to reproduce social trust across generations. The reconstruction of Ukraine, when it eventually happens, will face a paradox that the architects of the Marshall Plan never had to confront. The thing you are trying to rebuild, the human substrate of a functioning society, has been scattered across 30 countries and will not simply return because the shooting stops. People who have rebuilt their lives in Germany, Poland, and Canada do not come home because a peace agreement is signed. They come home, if they come home, slowly, selectively, and only if the conditions they return to are meaningfully better than the conditions they left. Creating those conditions requires exactly the human capital that has emigrated. This is the trap, and very few people in the rooms where reconstruction is being planned are talking honestly about it. The fifth, sixth, and seventh collapses are geographically diverse, but analytically connected by a single thread: the end of the commodity supercycle that sustained them and the absence of any alternative economic foundation built during the years of abundance. Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa, the largest economy on the continent, a country that for 20 years was the investment banker's favorite African growth story. Nigeria is now in the middle of a currency crisis, a fuel subsidy collapse, a security fragmentation across multiple regions, and a political class so thoroughly captured by oil rents that it has no institutional memory of how to govern a post-oil economy, because it has never had to. The oil is not gone, but the oil is no longer sufficient. And a state that was built entirely around the distribution of oil revenue has no architecture for anything else. Argentina, again, always Argentina. The country that has defaulted on its sovereign debt more times than any other in modern history, and that is, as of this moment, engaged in its most radical experiment yet. A deliberate, ideologically driven demolition of the state apparatus that, whatever its theoretical merits, is producing social dislocations that the Argentine political system, historically volatile, may not be able to absorb. This is not a prediction, this is a description of what is happening in real time. And Bangladesh, a country that the development community used to cite as one of the great success stories of the past 30 years. Genuine poverty reduction, genuine improvements in maternal health and female education, a garment sector that lifted millions into the formal economy. Bangladesh is now navigating a post-autocratic transition after the fall of a 15-year government with an economy that is more fragile than the headline numbers suggest. A garment sector facing structural pressure from automation and nearshoring, and a political culture that has never successfully managed a peaceful transfer of power between rival factions. What connects all 7 of these? What is the thread? It is this: every single one of these states was built on a foundation that was always temporary, a commodity boom, an authoritarian bargain, a geopolitical subsidy, a development narrative that papered over structural weaknesses, and every single one of them failed to use the window of apparent stability to build the institutions, the civic culture, the diversified economy, the genuine social contract that would have made them resilient when the temporary foundation shifted. The window always closes, the commodity boom ends, the geopolitical patron loses interest. The authoritarian strongman dies or is removed. The development narrative meets reality. And when the window closes, what is left is the foundation. And if the foundation was never built, what is left is rubble dressed up in the language of statehood. This is not pessimism. Pessimism would be saying that nothing can be done. What I am saying is something more uncomfortable than pessimism. That the things that could be done are already known, have been known for decades, are documented in the literature of development economics and comparative politics and institutional design. And that the reason they are not done is not ignorance. It is politics. It is the short time horizons of elected officials and military strongmen. It is the vested interests of elites who benefit from the dysfunction. It is the complicity of an international system that finds it easier to manage collapse than to prevent it, because prevention requires accountability and management requires only money. 7 countries, 7 warnings, and behind them, the architecture of an international order that has not yet reckoned with the scale of what is coming.